Hey nerdy knitters, have you ever been knitting happily along only to look down at your work and discover that there is a big hole in your knitting? You created a yarn over, you dropped a stitch, or any one of 6 different mistakes might have happened. In today's video, we're going to look at those 6 mistakes, how you can identify them, how you can fix them, and best of all, for most of these, you won't have to rip out your work. You can drop down and just fix that one stitch. Before we jump in, let me just say, hey, I'm Tanya here at Nerdy Knitting. I'm a certified knitting instructor and a knitwear designer, and my goal is to help you become a confident, adventurous knitter. The first common mistake that you'll often see is an accidental yarn over. Many knitters have done this. I've done this numerous times. This is really common, especially for new knitters, because usually you have to move that yarn back and forth between the needles when you're knitting and purling. But sometimes you accidentally carry the yarn over the needle instead of in between, and that creates an accidental yarn over. And it looks like a big hole in your knitting, but if you look to either side of it, you'll see there's a column of stitches and a column of stitches, and then where that hole is, there is no column of stitches. And that gives us a clue right there that this is going to be an easy fix. Now, if you happen to catch this accidental yarn over right on the very next row, it's really easy to fix. All you need to do is drop the yarn over right off your needle. There's nothing else you need to do. You might have to go around and adjust the stitches around it just to absorb some of that excess yarn, but that is it. You can just move right along with your knitting. If this happens further down and you don't notice until you've knit 3, 4, even more rows than that, it's no big deal. All you need to do is work to the position of that yarn over stitch where it was created. You look at the columns of stitches, you'll have 2 columns of stitches and a new column of stitches where that hole is right above. So you work to that stitch and then you just drop that stitch right off the needle. Let it fall right down to where that hole is, and it's not going to go any further because you started a new row there. There's no row underneath. The worst thing here, depending on the yarn you use, as you can see in this example, I used a really bulky yarn, so it really produces a huge ladder. But you can take that excess yarn and work it to the stitches to either side to help absorb some of that extra. Even with this bulky yarn, after I spent a few minutes working that excess yarn over to each side, it looks a lot better. Now, to avoid accidental yarn overs, you have to pay attention to where that yarn is, especially when you're moving between knits and purls. This usually happens when you've purled a stitch and you've forgotten to move the yarn to the back and you've inserted to knit and then you wrap the yarn, and that creates that accidental yarn over. Of course, there's other ways it can happen, but just make sure that you're moving your yarn in between your needles when you're moving back and forth between knits and purls, not over the needle, which creates that yarn over. The next way you can often see these holes in your knitting is with an incomplete stitch. This happens when you've inserted to knit a stitch, you've wrapped the yarn, but instead of drawing that new yarn through and letting the old stitch drop off the needle, you move both of them to your needle. And then this does a few things. When you work on the next row, you might work them as one stitch, or you might work them as separate stitches, which creates an extra stitch, plus it creates like that big gaping hole. Whichever way you've done it, if you've made an incomplete stitch, they're still simple to fix. You can see in this example here, when I came back to it on the next row, I just knit both of those strands together, and then it creates this odd looking stitch that you see later on, and it might create a hole as well. Now, if you happen to catch this right away on the next row, all you need to do is to pull that new stitch through the old one completely and let the old stitch drop off, and then you can keep working right across the row. If it's further down in your knitting, you're going to treat it sort of like a drop stitch, which we're going to get to later on, but you're going to have to drop down to that one point. So you just work over your row, mark that stitch so you know which column of stitches you're looking at, and when you get to that stitch, you can drop right down to that incomplete stitch, take it out, and then I like to use a crochet hook and pick each of those strands of knitting back up. Just follow them one row at a time and keep them in order, and you can get your stitches right back up on your needle and fix that incomplete stitch. Now, to avoid this one, you just have to pay attention to what you're doing and make sure as you're wrapping and pulling your new stitch through, you're letting that old stitch drop off the needle. The third way, and sort of a companion to that incomplete stitch, is an accidental knit one below, where instead of knitting into the stitch that's on the needle, you've knit into the stitch below the stitch on the needle, which is a stitch that you might want to use in some cases, but if you don't intend to, then you sort of create this elongated stitch. And when you look at that stitch, you can see that knit one below. It's kind of hard to see sometimes, but when you're looking at your stitches, you'll see one stitch that looks twice as tall as the other stitches. That is that knit one below. Now, if you happen to catch this on the very next row, you treat it sort of like a drop stitch. You just pull those 3 strands out and ladder them up correctly using your crochet hook 1 stitch at a time. And then I like to do this from the front of the work. It's just easier to see. And then once that stitch is back on your needle, you can just continue knitting right across the row. Now, if this one is further down, you'll do the same thing as if you had done that incomplete stitch. You're going to work to where that stitch is located, that column of stitches, and then you're going to drop down, ladder that down so you have all of those stitches undone, find that correct stitch, fix that knit one below, and then work your way back up 1 stitch at a time. Now, I know that laddering down seems like something that's really scary to do to your knitting. You don't want everything to unravel, but I promise it's really not hard to do, especially if you have an animal fiber or acrylic yarn. They tend to hold their stitches. You can see in the examples I've been showing, those stitches, I actually had to pull them apart to get them to come out. Now, if you're using a really slippery yarn, it's better to practice on something that has a little more grip until you're confident that you can pick up stitches easily. And then you can use this whenever you need to, even on fine yarn or lace. I promise you can do it. Number 4 on our list of potential hole problems in our knitting is an accidental make one. Now, you might have intended to put a make one, and if the pattern doesn't tell you to close that up and you just knit right through the center, it's going to leave a hole. And sometimes you want this. That's called a make one open. But sometimes you want to twist it. You might want to twist it a make one left or a make one right. I have a video all about that. You can check that out right here. But sometimes you accidentally do a make one. When you pick up the strand of yarn between 2 stitches instead of knitting the next stitch, that creates another stitch. And if you look at it, you can see it looks very similar to a yarn over. That's because it's almost exactly the same thing. A make one is sort of like if you forgot to add a yarn over, you can use a make one to replace that yarn over, and it's just as easy to fix. If you catch it on the very next row, drop it right off the needle, no problem. If you happen to see it's further down, just like the yarn over, you're going to work to the location of that new stitch that you've added, and you're going to drop that right down, and it's not going to keep unraveling because you created a whole new section of stitches. It will finish when it gets to that hole that you made. And like the yarn over, you might have to grab that crochet hook or an extra knitting needle and pull that excess yarn to the stitches to either side to even things up a little bit. Now, to avoid an accidental make one, just pay attention to what you're doing. Don't try to pick up that strand of yarn between the 2 stitches unless you're intending to make an increase. The 5th reason you could have a hole in your knitting is because you've dropped a stitch and you didn't notice and you just kept right on knitting, and then later on you happen to look and you've got this laddering thing going on and you might even have a big old hole. But this one is very easy to fix. Once you see that you've dropped a stitch, grab a stitch marker, a locking stitch marker, and put it right through the center of that stitch so it doesn't keep dropping down any further. And then, like the other times you've had to ladder down and pick your stitches back up, you're going to grab that crochet hook, insert it into that stitch, and then 1 strand of yarn at a time, pick it up and pull it through and work your way right back up to the stitch on your needles, and pop it on your needle and just continue working right across. Now we have the opposite problem here. When we have to drop excess yarn overs and make ones, we have all that extra yarn. But if you've dropped a stitch and not noticed for a while, when you pick it up, you might have to push those stitches to either side to find some of that yarn that you can use. So you have the opposite problem here. You have to pull some excess yarn from the surrounding stitches to create that new column of stitches. Now, the only way to avoid dropping stitches is to pay attention to what's happening on your needles. Make sure you are working each stitch before you're letting it off your left needle. Another thing that can cause holes is an accidental short row. If you've ever set your knitting down because you were distracted by the phone or the kids or the doorbell ringing, and when you came back to pick up your knitting, you started to knit back in the opposite direction instead of finishing the row you were on, you've created an accidental short row. Short rows are great when you want them, but not when you don't, and they can create a gaping hole in your work, and they also create an extra row of stitches on one side compared to the side where you stopped to work back the other way. Unfortunately, the only way to fix this is to rip out your work to before the point of that accidental short row, put your stitches back on the needle, and then continue working from there. There's no way to drop down and fix this one, unfortunately. Now, to avoid accidental short rows, you just have to pay attention to what you're doing. When you come back to your work, if you've put it down in the middle of a row, make sure that you look for the working yarn. It's attached to the last stitch you worked, and that last stitch should be the needle that goes in your right hand. While I was working on the swatch to show all the ways to make these holes, I discovered one more way. If you have some over large stitches, you can have some holes in your work. For me, it was because I had taken out those yarn overs that weren't supposed to be there, and I was working and moving all of that excess yarn to the stitches around, and I still had some really big stitches that looked like they had holes in them. The only solution for this is just to keep practicing your knitting. The more often you knit, the better your tension will be, and a few things that you can do: make sure your needles stay together. When you move them far apart, you add extra yarn in between, and that can work its way into those stitches. And work on the tips of your needles. That will keep you from creating really big stitches as well. With all of these, the best thing you can do is just to pay attention to what's happening on your needles as you're knitting, and looking at your fabric once in a while to make sure everything's looking okay. Now, all of the fixes we talked about today, I just worked in stockinette so you could really see what was going on. But you can work these fixes in any simple stitch pattern: garter stitch, seed stitch, anything like that. But if you're working a stitch pattern that uses a chart or written instructions where you're working repeats and you've accidentally added extra stitches, that's going to mess up your stitch count, and it's going to mess up your pattern too. So you might have to rip that out and work your way back up again. Now, if I've missed a way that you can get an accidental hole in your knitting, please leave me a comment telling me about it. And if you're watching this video, go and check the comments and see if there are any other ways that we didn't discuss in today's video. And if you're looking for more knitting tips and help, check out this playlist right here, and be sure to subscribe if you like to get nerdy with your knitting.